Welcome. My name is Lucan Wei. I'm professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Patriotic Program for the Study of Ukraine. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has detained and forcibly deported approximately between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians and deported them to Russia, often in the far isolated regions of the Far East. This includes approximately 260,000 children. So to discuss this and other sort of human rights abuses conducted by Russia during the war, we have three experts with us, and hopefully we'll be joined by a fourth. First, we have Professor Eugene Finkel, who's professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University and based in Bologna. He is author of a wonderful, insightful, nuanced book called Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust. And he's currently writing a book with basic books called To Kill Ukraine on the war. Next, we have Nataliia Hendel, who's research fellow at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. She's an expert on humanitarian law and teaches teachers and civil servants on humanitarian law. Next, we have Katerina Leshevska, who's a lawyer at the Regional Center for Human Rights and a Ph.D. student of international law at the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev. Hopefully, we will also be joined by Sasha Romantsova, the executive director of the Civil Liberties, of the Center for Civil Liberties. So when she comes on, hopefully I'll introduce her. So I'm going to start with you, Katerina. We've heard sort of really horrific stories about children being deported and forcibly adopted in Russia. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and the scale of this practice?
Yes, of course. Thank you. First of all, I would like to share my screen because I think that it will be very useful, and maybe some stories, some testimonies of these children, they're really terrifying. So, one technical issue. Here you can watch numbers. But behind each number, we have concrete story of child deported to Russia or forcibly transferred to other territories under the effective control of the Russian Federation. And all these children, they are totally different, and they are in the totally different conditions. We can distinguish some categories of children, and mostly among these approximately 260,000 children deported to Russia are children with one legal representatives, but we have others: orphans, children deprived of parental care, minors whose parents' fate is unknown, children with disabilities, also children who were transferred to the so-called re-education, and also children who were deported due to the results of the medical examinations carried out under the decree of the President Putin. We also have some children deported to Russia whose parents were captured by Russians, and then they were threatened that these children can be transferred to Russian families. So there are many different cases, and I would like to go through these cases and to present them in more details. Here on this screen, you can watch the boy. His name is Valentin. He is from the occupied Donbas region. This boy is already indoctrinated by Russians thanks for their programs of the so-called patriotic education in the territories of Ukraine occupied by Russians. Since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, this boy was transferred to the Moscow region, and after this, he was forcibly transferred to the Russian family. Then these new Russian parents, they were forced to be in hurry in order to create new Russian documents for this boy. It was very important for the process of the illegal adoption of this boy by this family. And according to testimonies of new Russian mother of this boy, they are not sure that he is really orphan, that he doesn't have parents or close relatives in Ukraine. They were called by guardianship institution of the Russian Federation. Then they were called by the Ministry of Social Affairs, and they were persuaded, they were forced to establish the foster care for this boy from Donbas region. We also have the story of two children from Luhansk region, occupied Luhansk region, and their new mother. This woman previously would like to adopt one boy from Novosibirsk region. It was one small boy, and he was at the good state of his health. But then this woman was called by Minister of Social Affairs, and she was forced to foster this boy from Novosibirsk region, but these two children from the so-called LPR, these two children, they are children with disabilities, they have like mental disorders, and now this woman is not happy to adopt these children because she is single, and she has other already adopted children. They are Russians. And also this woman has his biological son. And the story of the son is very interesting because he participated firstly in the so-called special military operation in Syria, and now he participates in the so-called special military operation, so the war against Ukraine. On this screen, you can see the photo of Anarch Marska. She is aged of 12 years, and she was forcibly transferred to Russian camps in order to be re-educated. I saw this girl, I had the meeting with this girl, and she told me, Katya, I cried every day because I would like to be with my mother. And they didn't tell me where is the end of this vacation. And you know, this situation, the situation of these children is even worse than detention in the prison. Because in prison, you know where is the end of your detention. And in these re-education camps, no. This girl, Anna, she was transferred firstly in one camp in Yevpatoria, and then she was displaced in two other camps. And this girl was punished by Russian monitors because she refused to speak Russian, and she refused to sing Russian anthem, so she refused to be re-educated. But thanks for private initiatives, thanks for our non-governmental organization Save Ukraine, this girl was returned to Ukraine. She was repatriated, and now she is with her mother. On this screen, you can watch the story of one other girl. Her name is Nastya. She is a teenager, and she was also transferred to the camps on the territory of the occupied Crimean Peninsula, where she was re-educated by Russians. Nastya told me that she was in these camps with Russian Russian children, and that is why there were many cases of bullying, because Nastya, as other Ukrainian teenagers, have already a very developed Ukrainian national identity. She refused to be re-educated. She refused to be Russified, indoctrinated, and militarized. And that is why now Russians called our teenagers like hard teenagers and develop special programs for their education. I think that now this category of children deported to Russia or transferred to occupied Crimean Peninsula, they are under the huge risk because some of them are aged of 17 years old. So after 1 year, they, like Russians, because the Russian State Duma recognized all our children, Russian children, they obtained a Russian passport, they were forcibly passportized, so they will be transferred to the special military operation as cannon fodder, as children from the occupied Crimean Peninsula, who were children in 2014, and then in 2022 were returned to Crimea dead. And on this screen, you can watch the photo of one family of father and his 3 children, and maybe this is the most terrible story, because this father was separated with his 3 children during the process of the so-called filtration. He was captured by Russians, and his children were transferred to the territory of the Russian Federation. Firstly, they were detained in special boarding institutions, and his father was in a special filtration camp, and then this father was liberated, and he was called by his son, and he was told that, father, you have only 5 days, and then they will transfer us to the Russian family. And I think that this case is not unique, it's not the single one. The Regional Center for Human Rights, my organization, we have documented 400 cases of forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to Russian families. But since October 2022, they don't have like unique procedures, some special procedure for adoption of our Ukrainian children. And according to the Russian Family Code, exists the secrecy of adoption. So now we don't have access to judicial decisions of the Russian courts, and we even don't understand the scale of this crime, the scale of the crime of illegal adoption. And even worse, that during this process, according to the previous practice of the Russian courts, parents changed everything: names, surnames, place of birth, date of birth. So we will not be able to identify these children, and without identification, we will not be able to repatriate them. The situation is really very critical, and I am very happy that today we have, fortunately, this a very strong and very decisive statement by the side of the ICC. We have 2 warrant arrests, and one of them related to Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian children ombudsman, the woman who is ahead of the implementation of all this policy of the Russification, indoctrination, eradication of Ukrainian national identity of these children. And even worse, Maria Lvova-Belova adopted by herself, with many violations even of the Russian legislation, boy from Mariupol, Filip Holovnya. And now this boy is in her family. We know that Philippe has also a sibling, a very small sister, and unfortunately we think that in future Maria Lvova-Belova can adopt also this girl. So now we need some continuation of this decisive answer for this crime, and we hope that maybe in future the international community can recognize that this is not only war crime, This is not only crime against humanity, but this is really genocide against the Ukrainian nation, the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the Russian national group. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Nataliia, I mean, Katrina mentioned filtration and filtration camps. Can you sort of talk a little bit about what are filtration camps and what does that mean? And maybe put these abuses in sort of the context of other human rights abuses by the Russian government during the war.
It's a huge problem to Ukrainians about filtration camp, because filtration is a process when the deportation or illegal transportation from Ukrainian from occupied territory for Russian Federation and for the territory which was controlled from Russian Federation. In this filtration camp, the militaries can take decision about the futures of Ukrainian citizens. Can they be deported for another territory occupied for Donetsk or Luhansk region, or to the Russian Federation, or not, or can be imprisoned. And in this filtration camp, Ukrainian citizens can be, for them can be torture to use, or inhumanity treatment. For example, if this person has have relatives in Ukrainian militaries, or if they have Ukrainian position, for example, and this person checked the clothes, the mobile phones, all digital, all notebooks, and another subject when the militaries can check the information about the position for Ukrainian position or for support of Russian Federation. And this is the first step about for take decision about the futures of these persons. Then, if the decision is that this person is clean politically, it can be deportation for another region in the Russian Federation. But when this person, Ukrainian citizen, deported for another Russian regions, they have another violation of human rights. For example, it's opportunity to realize the rights to health. It's access to medical care. It's access to legal help, because a lot of these people don't have legal document, passports, and etc. And that's why they cannot leave the territory of the Russian Federation and should stay in the Russian Federation. The another violation is the violation about that these people don't have the financial support to live in Russian Federation, for example. And the most violation in this situation is deportation is the violation of human rights and international humanitarian law during armed conflict.
Thank you. Zhenya, so when you look at this kind of behavior, can you put this in some historical perspective? I mean, why would the Russian government engage in this kind of behavior, especially with the children? It does not seem to have any kind of military value, or why would they expend, I'm assuming, quite significant resources doing this kind of thing? You're muted.
Sorry, 3 years of living on Zoom and I'm still falling for that stuff. Okay, so thanks, Lucan, and thanks for my co-panelists. And to answer your question, when I hear what they describe, I just can't stop thinking about other periods of Ukrainian history. And there is a saying that history does not repeat itself but rhymes. Well, here, when it comes to Russian actions in Ukraine, it's probably much closer to repeating itself than to rhyming. And, when we talk on deportations, that's our focus for today's discussion, and obviously it's all over the news right now. Then just let's go back and see why Russia does what it does. And as most people here surely know, Russia's obsession with Ukraine and attempts to control Ukraine is nothing new. They have done it for many years, decades, several centuries. And this has been driven by two key factors. First is security. And at times, security threat to Russia might come from Poland. At times, it can come from Austro-Hungary or Germany. Now it is NATO, but a threat from the West is a common trope, and that goes to the question, well, why do it if you care about security? But security is not the only thing that Russia cares about. A second factor that explains Russian
I'm sorry. What is the security? You're saying that they partly do it because of security, but what is the logic here?
Right. I'm not saying that right now they do it in terms of security. What I'm trying to say is that what Russia does in Ukraine is historically driven by security concerns, and that's a fear of Germany or Poland or Austro-Hungary, or in this case, NATO. But the second factor is also identity. Then that is perception of Russia as a historically Russian territory, and that Ukrainians and Russians are essentially the same people, two branches of the Slavic people. That's a trope that Putin is very fond of, and people around him quote and repeat constantly. And those deportations might not make sense, when you think about security, but they make much more sense when you approach the war from the identity perspective and trying to deport people, ethnic Ukrainians, but not only ethnic Ukrainians, and cleanse the territory or make the territory more Russified is a constant pattern of what Russia does. So if we go back in time, just let me give you several examples going back to World War I. Russia, during the early stages of the war, Russia occupied Galicia and Bukovina, Western Ukraine, but back then they were part of Austro-Hungary. What Russia does immediately after the occupation? Well, of course, it tells everyone that they plan on annexing the territories and making them Russian. They ban the Ukrainian language, but they also start deporting people in large numbers. For identity reasons, they want to cleanse the territory from people they consider alien. In this case, we're talking about Jews and Germans, but they also start expelling Ukrainians, those who seem to the Russian authorities as the key drivers of the Ukrainian national identity. For instance, Metropolite Sheptytsky, who is the head of the Greek Catholic Church in Western Ukraine, got deported to Central Russia, then was moved to Kiev. Various journalists and community leaders were deported to the Russian Empire. That was mostly for security concerns, to make sure that those people do not oppose the Russian control of Galicia and Bukovina. But there also were cases of children, Ukrainian children, that were adopted, that with the attempt to Russify them, to bring them up as Russians. So here, when I hear what Russians are doing, in places like Mariupol or Donbass, you can pretty much copy paste what Russia did in 1914, 1915, move it 100 years forward, and not much will change. 1920s, 1930s, the key feature of the collectivization campaign is, of course, deportation of richer peasants, tens of thousands, to the same places where many of the Ukrainian kids are now being deported, Siberia and the Far East, both for security reasons, but more importantly, for identity reasons. And World War II, we talk about deportation of Crimean Tatars, that the the most well-known case of Russian deportations during World War II. But if you look at what the Soviet authorities did in Western Ukraine, both in 1939, 1941, and also after the Soviet power return in 1944, it was just a series of mass deportations. Some, like Poles, for identity reasons, but also Ukrainians who were deported, some for security reasons, some for identity reasons, because they were nationalists, or because they were perceived as too active or too religious or too close to opposition to the Soviet rule. Not just children, but entire families. So here, I think the focus on children does make the current situation, if not unique, then somewhat different from what we see historically. But if you look at the pattern of Russian policies in Ukraine over time, you see the deportations and population movements to make Ukraine fully subordinated to Russia, to deport, to change Ukrainians' identities, either locally or, if needed, to take them to Russia and then re-educate them there. It's a constant feature of Russian attempts to dominate Ukraine, both for security reasons, because those people are seen as a threat to Russian rule, including the children. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, so you said that the deportation of children made this a bit distinctive from the previous. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, because previously what we saw is deportation of entire groups or entire communities or entire families. In previous cases, there were, I know of cases where children were taken away from their parents, but I don't think that I am aware of specific policies of separating children as a state project to the extent that it does happen now. Now, from what I understand, not just children are being deported from Russian occupied Ukraine right now, but I think the focus on children is not unique, but somewhat different from past campaigns. But it's a variation of the same theme of taking Ukrainian populations, not just Ukrainians, but the population of Ukraine, and trying to erase diversity, to make them more Russified, and more compliant to Russian rule. So if you look at it at historical perspective, I apologize, I'm absolutely not surprised that Russia does deport people, does deport Ukrainians in large numbers. The focus of children, maybe, when we get more understanding of Russian decision-making, we will know more about why this is the case, but that does make it a bit different, though definitely not unique.
Okay, so maybe I'll come in with some of the audience questions. First of all, Michael Campbell asks about people who voluntarily go to Russia. I mean, I'm assuming there are many Ukrainians who have voluntarily fled the war to Russia. I'm assuming that these numbers of deportations does not include those who voluntarily go to Russia. Is that right, Katrina or Nataliia? Do you want to answer that?
So I can start, and maybe Nataliia will add in more details. What does it mean voluntarily? When you didn't have the possibility to be evacuated to Ukraine because the Russian Federation shelled all humanitarian corridors, whether it was voluntarily, or maybe when, for example, Russian military went to your home and told you that you have only 50 minutes and then we would destroy your house. Whether it was voluntarily, or maybe these parents who gave their consent to the so-called vacation and re-education in these Russian camps, whether it was voluntarily, when you were threatened that without this consent you would be deprived of parental care. So no, it's not about some goodwill. It's not about some very informed consent. No, it's about international crime. It's about deportation. So we calculate all persons deported to Russia as a person deported, and we know that many of them have managed to cross the border of European countries in order to escape from Russia, because they didn't want to be in Russia. They didn't want to be under the effective control of Russians, and they really have managed to escape to other countries in order to avoid to be Russified, and in order to avoid that their children will be indoctrinated and militarized.
Nataliia, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a comment. For example, it's a filtration camp. The filtration camp, it's not about voluntary. It's about violation of a human rights, violation of international humanitarian law, because it's Ukrainian citizens don't have any opportunity to have legal support, to have some products that they need, foods, for example, and medical support. And in filtration camps, this person can be tortured, for example, and we have a lot of information about this violation, and a lot in the filtration camp, the people can be killed, for example, and it's not about voluntary, it's about violation, about crime, as mentioned Katerina before. Thank you.
Right. So in this context, you don't feel that there's making the distinction between voluntary and involuntary really makes sense, given the context. I mean, many of these, I'm assuming, just don't have much choice either way. And so in that context, talking about a kind of voluntary immigration to Russia really doesn't make sense. So Donald Schwartz asked about the ethnic breakdown of the deported children. Do you have any information on that, Katerina or Nataliia?
Unfortunately, only the Russian Federation knows
Right.
how many children and what children it has deported to its own territory. So it's really difficult to identify not only ethnic identity of these children, but even names and surnames, because the Russian Federation didn't provide at least the ICRC with informational card for each child deported to Russia. So here it violated the rules of the international humanitarian law, and that is why we lack this information. But when we are talking about, for example, the alleged genocide against the Ukrainian nation, we insist that these children, they are like the part of Ukrainian national group and not ethnical group, because children identity, the process of development of the children identity is ongoing until the age of 18. So it's really difficult to understand. And when we are talking about Russian and Ukrainian group, ethnicity is not a good point to understand. So we insist that they are Ukrainian nationals, they are our Ukrainian citizens, even if the Russian Federation created many Russian documents for them in order to simplify the procedure of their integration into the Russian national group.
Well, let's talk about genocide. Zhenya, I think you were, at least I remember on social media, one of the first people who has an expertise in this area who sort of called Russians' actions genocide. First of all, can you kind of talk about why I believe you think it's genocide, and then maybe sort of talk about in this kind of put perhaps the sort of deportation of children and other deportations in this context?
Right. So you're right. I have been talking, screaming, writing, doing whatever I can about this for almost a year now, since I think a day or two after Bucha. In April 2022, why it is a genocide? Well, it is a genocide in my view because it does fit the accepted UN definition of genocide, which is acts committed with the intent to destroy a national, racial, religious, or ethnical group as such in whole or in part. And here we're not talking about a religious group or racial group, not even an ethnical group. Here we're talking about Russia trying to destroy Ukrainians as a national group. And we're very clear about intent. The Russian authorities and Russian state media absolutely open about, their desire to not just to subjugate Ukraine or control Ukraine. That would be imperial. That would not be genocidal, but just to destroy the identity or destroy the nation as such. And here, actually, the kidnapping of children is probably the best evidence that we have, because there is a specific list of actions that the genocidal action according to the UN Convention, such as killing members of the group, causing bodily harm, but also transferring children from one group to another. And there are many reasons for why people get killed during wartime. Some of them genocidal, some of them are not. And unless and until we know the motivations of each of those Russian soldiers who pulled the triggers, and unless we get our hands on a document that says kill Ukrainians as such, most likely doesn't exist. If there are orders, they would have been given. Or then connecting intent to violence on the ground is almost impossible from the legal perspective. That's why quite a few lawyers are very reluctant about using the term genocide. I'm not a lawyer, I'm looking at the campaign as a whole. It's not my job, to put people behind bars. But when it comes to kidnapping of children and specifically taking them from their families, transferring them to Russia and bringing them up as Russians, so changing their identities, there are no ambiguities about that, especially when the Russian state is very explicit about their goals. So for now, the transfer of children is probably the best evidence we have to make a case for an attempted genocide that Russia is committing in Ukraine.
Yeah, so can you, recently it's been announced that UN is refusing or says it doesn't have enough evidence to call it genocide. Can maybe one of you sort of indicate, so what evidence, as someone who sort of is obviously not an expert in this area at all, and you look at Russian media, you also look at sort of the facts that, that Russia is bringing in Russian language teachers, which obviously has zero security. It's not at all about, sort of preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. This seems obviously, bare minimum, this war has a huge cultural component of erasing Ukrainian culture. How is that not genocide? So what are they waiting for? Like, what sort of evidence would they need to call it genocide? Can any of you, or Zhenya, can you?
I can jump in, even though, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, and but so I skimmed the report, read the news, so I'm not entirely sure what the exact justification is. They're saying that so far they have not found enough evidence, so it's not so the conclusion is not final. But again, it's my speculation that it goes back to this discussion that, we social scientists and historians having with international lawyers about whether to call it a genocide, because they use a bar that almost impossible to meet, simply because of how the Genocide Convention is structured. You need to prove intent when intent when documents might not exist at all or been given orally, and you need to prove this intent in specific cases of murder, which, again, given the absence of documentation, and we don't have access to Russian archives or the internal communication, is almost impossible to do. So I understand their reluctance from the legal point of view. After all, it will be their job to defend this determination in the court of law, such as the ICC. But for me, it's absolutely inexplicable when they look at the campaign as a whole. Now, going back to your point about Russian features and such, it's actually not genocidal as such according to the convention. right? So you are in Canada, and cultural genocide is a term that is used in Canada in relations to the First Nations. But if you look at the convention, there is nothing about destruction of culture or language. It wasn't the original definition that Raphael Lemkin came up with, but it's not in the legal document itself. So you need to look at physical violence and transfer of children to prove genocide.
Nataliia, do you have anything to add to this? Okay, maybe we can, Katerina, do you have anything to add?
Yes, as one of the authors of the submission to the ICC related to the crime of the genocide and to these actions of namely Maria Lvova-Belova, we have already proved even in October 2022 that this person has this dolus specialis, special intent in order to destroy Ukrainian national group. I have even a citation from one of her interviews. And she told that firstly, they transferred to Russia as a group of 30 children from Mariupol. These children sang Ukrainian anthem. Also, they hated Putin and they hated Russia. But after the process of forcible transfer to Russian families and after the process of the so-called re-education, she can to watch by her proper eyes how the process of integration into the Russian national group began. So Maria Lvova-Belova testified against her, and we can prove it. And also, of course, we can prove other elements like material element, general intent, and knowledge. So I think that the ICC will provide the international community and Maria Lvova-Belova by some other legal qualification, but in future. And now I think that this is political decision in order to qualify such actions like war crimes, because, you know, when these 100,000 Ukrainian children are now in Russia and only Russia knows names and surnames of these children, and institutions, facilities where these children are detained, we cannot like to aggravate the situation, even if the situation is not really difficult. Ukraine, unfortunately, will need to cooperate with Russia in order to repatriate these children. So maybe after this repatriation, we will watch some other qualification, I'm sure, because of course the existing international practice of international judicial institutions, for example, decision in the case Russia case against Nazis, we have qualification of the genocide, and the actions are the same.
Okay, so are you, I mean, can you just clarify? So I mean, Jenya sort of implied that they kind of almost make the legal standards so high that it's kind of impossible to you know, to satisfy. I mean, do you think there, by the sort of legal standards, is there sufficient evidence? I mean, I'm assuming you're agreeing that there's sufficient evidence now, and so I mean, so is it your interpretation then that the sort of decision not to call it genocide is kind of purely political, or could we imagine a situation in which they would uncover evidence and then the UN would call it genocide?
So I think that, of course, it's political decision, and I think with all existing international practice, how to determine a special intent, and with all the statements of Maria Lvova-Belova, of Mr. Putin, with all these material elements, we can prove that this is really genocide. But we need time, you know, for the international community to tell that enduring the armed conflict, because the armed conflict is ongoing, to tell that this is genocide, it's a very decisive step. I think that they are not ready, unfortunately, to do it now, but in future, yes.
So what are the implications? Like, why? I mean, I guess, so why is it? I'm sort of ask a kind of intentionally naive question, but why is it important to call this genocide? What kind of implications does this have? Eugenia, do you want to? Why, you've been spending a lot of your sort of waking hours making the case for genocide. I mean, why is it so important to sort of make this? Yeah.
I think it's important.
So
I will let Katerina maybe to
Go ahead.
start.
Go ahead, Katerina.
so I think that firstly, we are talking about the rights of victims. So, and victims, children victims especially, they have this right to the truth. And how to cause these crimes is really important in order to guarantee this right to truth. And also all Ukrainian nation need this needs this right to truth and need the proper name of crime committed by Russians in Ukraine during this war. But also I think that it is really important for the international community, and for us as Ukrainians, we have really a very good result of such recognition, because, you know, according to the convention, to the Genocide Convention, prohibition of the genocide is the norm of is the erga omnes norm. So the whole international community has obligation to punish persons who commit these crimes. And in this case, in the case of recognition of such actions as genocide, no one in the world, for example, won't be able to refuse to transfer Putin to The Hague in order to guarantee his presence during hearing, for example. And also the same case of Maria Lvova-Belova. So this is really important. Qualification matters. And for example, for this fair compensation and all other processes, from the legal perspective, we should qualify correctly. And, you know, when we recognize one concrete crime enshrined in the Rome Statute, like forcible transfer of children from one group to another as war crime, how we can guarantee that someone will respect this rule in future? So other aggressor can implement the same practice, because this is only war crime and not crime of genocide.
Zhenya, do you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you. So I absolutely agree that a lot of the reasons for calling it a genocide are political, because unfortunately there is this implied hierarchy of crimes, and genocide is at the top of this hierarchy. It's the crime of crimes, as many people say. So once you say the word genocide, people listen, and it's important for drawing attention to what is going on in Ukraine, for gaining support for Ukraine. And we saw it last year. Once we started talking about genocide, and once not just scholars like Timothy Snyder or myself and others mentioned it, but especially when President Biden said genocide, then the world stopped and started paying more attention. Now, it doesn't mean that we should call something that does not qualify as a genocide just to get this attention. But once the definitions are met, I see absolutely no reason to be overcautious about not calling it a genocide. So international dimension, but also memory and Ukrainian national identity and reconciliation and moving forward after the war is over. There will be a substantial difference in how Ukraine comes out of this war and remembers it if we recognize it a genocide and do it early on, rather than having those debates later. So those are, I think, the key reasons. I'm not talking about legal accountability. I will leave it to lawyers, but as a political scientist, I think collective memory, collective identity, and international support for Ukraine are the key reasons why it matters.
Okay, Nataliia,
Thank you. I just to add some points. First of all, when we talk about genocide for Ukraine, why it's important. It's important for justice. Firstly, as Katerina mentions about victims. First of all, and secondly, it's about prevention this crime in future in other places. And thirdly, it's about that Russia as Russian Empire, then USSR, then the Russian Federation always tried to destroy to Ukrainians and to Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian traditions. That's why now we have this opportunity. We remember the Holodomors in Ukraine, which was committed by USSR, and now this political decision which made in a lot of countries about to qualify as Holodomor as a genocide of Ukrainians, and that's why we should react to this action. For now, it's I think it's very important for Ukrainian. That it will be never again for Ukrainians in the future. Thank you.
I want to thank you. I want to welcome Sasha Romantsova. She's the executive director of the Center for Civil Liberties, and she's long been a human rights activist monitoring violations of human rights in the war zones. It's a pleasure to have you. And you're also, I should add, a laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize, for your work in the organization. So, first of all, congratulations again on that. And I'm going to sort of start with, I think, so we just as this panel started, I sort of got news that the ICC has put out an arrest warrant on Putin. I mean, can you talk about that and its significance?
Yeah, sure, because it's concrete connected with our topic today. It's deportation, because it's huge case about deportation of children. It's de facto kidnapping, and first of all, orphan children from occupied territory. And we have more than 60,000 names of children. So it's we understood that it's much more children, because a lot of children lose their parents during the war. But now we speak with concrete list of names, because these children was orphaned and cared by state. So why exactly this case? Because it's only one public signature of Putin, special order about easily way to adopt these children. That's why exactly International Criminal Court take this case, because we have concrete argument that responsibility about this order, take these children, give them to adopt, broken the Ukrainian law and broken the Russian law to Russian families. So it's one of the part of deportation exactly, and Ukrainian nationality, because they exactly disconnect children with their Ukrainian identity, they lose their contact, they lose their language and all of this. And they hiding information about these children, so Ukrainian state can control what happened with them. So this warrant given not only for Putin, but both with Maria Lvova-Belova, who is ombudsman about children's rights in Russian Federation, and she.
Sorry, I think we're broken up there. It looks like she's on a train. Do you want to, in the meantime, Nataliia, can you kind of comment on the ICC and your thoughts on that? Yeah, maybe Nataliia, can you?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Hi, Sasha, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just finished without video because for better connection. So that means 123 countries who is participants of International Criminal Court need to arrest Putin when they have him, for example, some meeting or some J20 in India or something like this. So that means we have a really much closer to our our version of justice for after this war, and except that sure, like USA, for example, not participant of International Criminal Court, but I think for developed country it will be the same, like a signal to arrest and send Putin to the Hague.
So I mean, I'm assuming that it's sort of hard to imagine practically a country arresting a head of state like Putin. I mean, has that ever happened before? A sitting head of state? I mean, or is this kind of, or I mean, I guess what is sort of I mean, I can understand the sort of symbolic implications are sort of clear, and this is very positive in sort of holding Putin accountable. But I mean, in terms of practical implications, will this mean that Putin, you know, will resist traveling abroad? I'm not sure how much he travels anyways. But Nataliia, maybe can you talk about sort of the implications of, or the importance of the ICC ruling?
Yes, this order is very important for for Ukrainians, first of all, then for all international community, because it's about accountability. And we know that practically it will be very hard to realize this order in the life, but it's some legal victory for this period of the war for Ukraine, and not only for Ukraine, and for ICC too, for example. And hopefully states which are the party of Rome Statute, maybe it will happen then Putin will be in the territory of this state, and this state can arrest him and Maria below. But for now, it's some pushing for all Russian leaderships about that they can be responsible for their action, for their violation, and for their committed of war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression crime, but for not this case, but always for about the situation in Ukraine.
Right. And Sasha, I don't know if you're still there. Did you say 60,000 or 16,000?
16,000. It's concrete list. Right. Yeah, so it's concrete list, but a lot of other states agency told about much bigger numbers. And from one side, from other sides, you need to understand that it's continual crime, so they still continue to do that. So one of the goal of this order, it's exactly stop this, make some cool effect, some frozen effect for these continual crimes, and because they try and do that again and again. So that's exactly, we need to understand that occupation of territory of Ukraine, that's not means it is just a change of flag. That means that every day we have a new and new war crimes against humanity, and some elements of genocide there. So that's why for us so important such international decision, which exactly showing for people who is who handled that like by their own hands, like soldiers, that even Putin can be accused if they do something like such level of international crime. So it's need to little afraid them, exactly.
So I'm going to ask, turn to you, Professor Ronald Suni. Eugenia, expresses concern in the Q&A that we not essentialize the nature of Russia through the ages. And there's certainly, there's sort of many, solid scholars have shown that sort of during the Soviet period, there were efforts to sort of promote Ukrainian culture. I mean, how would you respond to that? Since, is that a danger that we're sort of essentializing this relationship, or can you comment on that?
Okay, so thanks. And when Ron says something, I shut up and listen. But more seriously, I do agree that yes, there is some sort of essentializing Russia as as a single-minded empire hell bent on raising Ukraine and Ukrainian identity, and he's absolutely right that there were also periods, although brief ones, during the Soviet state where there were attempts to promote Ukrainian culture. And that's why I'm personally not, not bringing it all down to identity, and also talking about security concerns, which also change over time. So I think that I'm reading the comment right now. I absolutely agree that the history of those two people intertwine, and it's not just Russia trying to dominate Ukraine. There were also internal Ukrainian dynamics that affect this history over time, and we should not ignore those. I'm absolutely not suggesting anything like that. Having said that, I think on the state level, if we look at the last a century and a half at least, there is some constant threat, not uninterrupted. So the communist revolution and the period of Ukrainization was this interruption. 1960s was an interruption, early 1990s was an interruption, but outside those periods of interruption, I think we do see some very consistent policy towards Ukraine and perception of Ukraine as as a people which are not very different from Russia, and a sense of entitlement toward territories that constitute parts of Ukraine. So yes and no. I agree that we should not essentialize Russia, but at the same time, there are historical continuities that we simply cannot ignore.
Thank you. So I have actually a related question for you, Katarina, which is that there's been recent studies by some Kiev Mahila scholars that have, they ask questions about, who is responsible for the invasion? Is it Putin's government or the Russian people? And it appears, if I remember correctly, that they show that there's been, since sort of spring of 2022, there's been an increase in numbers of Ukrainians who see the war as not simply Putin's war, but as a war, by the Russian people. And I believe you've sort of spoken about collective responsibility. Why in Ukraine does there seem to be so much consensus, as correct me if I'm wrong, that this is not simply Putin's attack or Putin's government attack on Ukraine, but the sort of Russian people's attack on Ukraine?
Because it's not Putin who adopts Ukrainian children in Russia. It's not Putin who transfers the border of Ukraine with arms. It's not Putin who killed our fathers, brothers, and our relatives. It's not Putin. It's Russians, and they have choice. They are not victims of the Putin regime. No, they are people. They have brain, and they can decide. They can stop Putin, but they choose to continue this war. They choose to continue to carry out aggressive armed conflict against our nation. And of course, they support this so-called special military operation. We have many evidence for this, and it's not just because they are afraid of Putin. No, they really support. In their media, we have watched, and we watch even now, the hatred language. We watch direct incitement to the genocide. And it's not even only about media, but also about the Russian Orthodox Church. So there are a lot of evidence that this is not the war of Putin, but this is the war of Russians. And of course, there is no collective accountability in the international law. So it's only Putin and some other responsible person who directly committed these war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even genocide, will be punished in future. But Russians should pay for this war, and we hope that they will at least pay some compensation for our victims and also some reparation for our state, because they provoked many damages.
So at the same time, of course, we know that some Russians have spoken out and suffered, been jailed for sort of very, simple acts like spreading information about Russian war crimes in Ukraine. I mean, and so, they've, been jailed for many years. I mean, how would you respond to the fact that it clearly is very costly right now in Russia to sort of criticize the war? I mean, does that sort of at all affect your opinion of whether the Russian people as such, as opposed to the government, is responsible for the war? I mean,
can I comment this moment? Because it's really, you need to understand that Russia declared in their constitution that they're responsible for their state, they're responsible for their choice. Democracy, it's not only some rights, it's obligations, and part of this obligation, stop your own president if he is mad. So same what exactly Ukrainians do. That's why Ukrainians now responsible for their state and Russia responsible for their state. We have thousands of our friends, human rights defenders, independent journalists who mostly now working in exile, who exactly support us from 2014. They told about that Crimea, it's crime. I mean exactly annexation of Crimea, that war crimes Russia army doing not only in Ukraine but before that in South Caucasia, in Chechnya, in Syria, Mali, Georgia, Moldova, all of these places. So it's question about responsibility of citizen. If all you trying to stop that inside, or you trying to stop outside together, join with the other people who believe in democracy and maybe in Russia order, democracy Russia order. But we need to really, when we speak with these people, I mean, it's memorials, for example, they say like we are accept the Nobel Prize in this year, or when we speak with independent journalists, they trying to do something and they feel this responsibility. And so it will be their own decision if they won after victory of Ukraine, if they want to come back to Russia and be a part of this tax system, which exactly will be paying by reparation, or and will be, maybe it will be not exactly one country, it will happen something other, but situation that you can just stop your responsibility if you don't like what you do in your country, or you exactly refuse from your citizens. So it's one of the ways, sure. But we don't have other mechanisms. You're responsible for your state. That's why Ukrainians start Yanukovych, because we don't have a procedure of illustration, not illustration, impeachment. We have this word in constitution. That's why we need a peaceful demonstration like Maidan, like Euromaidan and that one. So because that was our fail, that we don't have more strongly political forces, which exactly not providing these procedures through the legislation. So that's why we're going and fighting till president, who is not exactly make their function, need to be escaped. He's just a chicken, yeah. So he is escaped. And after this, we are not changing exactly rules how elected our president or something else. So same situation with Russian Federation. And when we speak about concrete people who do a lot to trying to stop regime Putin, they understood that they're responsible for that they fail. We support them, we collaborate with them. They together with us documented war crimes at the Donbass, and they feel this responsibility. So it's not means that we're trying to cancel exactly Russians. Russians need to be supported in their process to find themselves, because even when we speak about so-called Russian culture or something like this, nobody exactly know what it means, Russian culture, because half of this culture, so-called, it's culture of Ukrainian artists, Georgian artists, Estonian artists, and all other, which exactly Russian repatriate. So it's a great opportunity for a health part of Russian society, exactly find they own identity, they own collect their own, collect their own history and their own art. So it's just one of the ways. So it's same like Ukrainians. We feel responsibility for our states. We feel responsibility for question how aggressive we will be after victory. We feel responsibility to the question not to radicalize our society. Even now, even during the war, we sure have a right, have an emotion, we sure have a right to hate people who are trying to kill us. But exactly if we will speak about Russian non-Russians. I'm from Russian-speaking family, and now all my families say we are not Russians. Even my mom was born in the territory of Russian Federation, they don't want to be Russians. She exactly put 30 years of her life in the new project, which called Ukraine. So that's why really important to understand that it's not about past. It's about, first of all, about future, that Ukraine, it's society, multi-ethnical, multi-language, multicultural, multi-religion society, which exactly have our vision of future. Democracy, rule of law, your own responsibility for your own life. And Russian society, which exactly, as for me, will be a huge question, how we get it happened exactly, create 140 million people who are not responsible for their lives. A huge territory, biggest territory, exactly. And how we pass that moment that it's starts to be possible. So it will be always our neighbors in different form. Maybe it will be Russian Federation, maybe other forms of countries, but it always will be our neighbors. And we need to think about, first of all, protect ourselves, because now it's a question for Ukrainians to be alive. And second, build exactly understanding how live with such neighbors. We have exactly hard neighbors from all the sides, you know. We have Belarusians, we have Hungarians, our neighbors, we have Turkish, our neighbors, saying all of these countries have problems with democracy. But that's why so tough choice for Ukraine to make a choice for democracy. So yes, Russians will be responsibility, yes, but healthy.
Okay, I think you cut out there. Nataliia sort of asked a question regarding sort of, gender-based violence.
If Ukraine is for normal and democracy life.
Okay, thank you. So Nataliia asked an important question about what is happening to women and girls, in particular in gender-based violence, sexual crimes, trafficking, etc. Nataliia, can you speak to these types of crimes, which seem sort of very much part of the war, as in many wars? But
maybe I will start, but Katerina and Alexander may add some information. First of all, we have two situations. First situation about sexual violation in the occupied territory, when Ukrainian prosecutors can open the criminal proceeding about these crimes, and this criminal proceeding were opened, and now investigators, for example, and in General Prosecutor Office in Ukraine, we have special department about war crimes, because this violation can be qualified using Article 438 in Ukrainian Criminal Code, for example, violation of laws and customary of armed conflict, for example, is the same as a war crime. In other words, it's one situation when we deoccupy it and we can access to investigate these crimes. The another situation is the sexual violation and gender violation in occupied territory and in the Russian Federation. And in this situation, we know that Ukraine, CRC, and another different structure of UN don't have access for Ukrainians, for example, in the occupied territory. That's why it's very hard to investigate this violation, for example. But when this woman and girl leaves this territory and move to another source country, in this country can open the criminal proceeding using the universal jurisdiction, for example, because the sexual violation committed during armed conflict, it committed with the Russian militaries can qualify as war crime, and war crime can be investigated using through the universal jurisdiction, and for example, in Poland's protection jurisdiction.
Okay. No, thank you. Does anybody else have something to add on that? Or there was another question about the role of the LNR, DNR, the people's so-called People's Republics. I mean, first of all, at this point, I guess one question is, can we even see these governments as somehow separate from the Russian government, which I just don't know empirically. But what would be their interest in deporting these people from their territories? Katerina, can you speak to that, or?
Yes, first I would like to add to Nataliia that there is also one problem with victims of the sexual and gender-based violence, because now, unfortunately, mostly they are not ready to speak up about this crime, and we can understand. And what is really horrible is that in every occupied territory by the Ukrainian army, we have documented cases of the sexual and gender-based violence, and not only against the women and the girls, but also against men and boys. And the age of victims of the sexual and gender-based violence vary from 4 years old to more than 80 years old. So this is really terrifying. When we are talking about the role of the so-called DPR and LPR in the commission of this alleged genocide and deportations, their role is crucial and huge, because the process of deportation started in these territories not on February 24, but on February 18. For example, in the DPR, because Pushilin ordered these deportations, and the first victims of these deportations were unfortunately children deprived of parental care and children orphans, and they were also the first victims of the forcible transfer to Russian families. And this process started in the so-called LPR on February 20. So it's even before the large-scale invasion. And unfortunately, the role of the DPR is more highlighted by the international community. We watch that many persons, even the so-called children ombudsman of the DPR is included in sanction list, but the same person in the LPR, no. And of course, we don't understand why, because in the LPR, this children ombudsman is directly appointed by Maria Lvova-Belova. So she is a person of Maria Lvova-Belova, and she started to implement very actively this policy of deportation and forcible transfer to Russian families. Now they are working in order to unify legislation of the so-called LPR and DPR, and also they started to unify registers of these children deprived of parental care and children orphans with the federal base of the Russian Federation. So in these territories, the processes are very fast and faster than in newly occupied territories, Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast. So we shouldn't underestimate the role of these republics, because they stimulate and they encourage these processes. And also Pushilin told that each child in the DPR should have family, and of course this is Russian family. So they even didn't hide that they would like to transfer children to Russia and to transfer them to forcible adoption.
Thanks. Jenny, do you have anything to add? Or so there's a question that Professor Marta Dachuk asked about, so going back to the ICC, or whether it makes sense, or whether there will be sort of a trial in absentia, since it's rather unlikely. I mean, I think we can probably agree that Putin himself will ever be on the docket. I mean, does that make sense in your view, or is that likely to happen? I'll ask you, Nataliia. sort of what you tell us? Is this often happen that sort of there are sort of trials of these kind of figures like Putin in absentia? Is that? Can you speak to that?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, and it will be great if it will be possible, for example, but I think we understand how it's legally a lot of problems to realize and to this process, and how to illegally it will be great, but I think now we have the political and legal mechanism to provide this in life, for example.
Okay.
It's my short answer, because it's a lot of problem and a lot of steps to doing with using diplomacy, using legal mechanism, and it's a huge work for future, maybe for in this helpful year, for example.
Okay. Well, thank you, all of you. I think we're going to wrap it up there. This was an important discussion. This is obviously a very, very, very important topic that demands more attention. And I thank you so much, Nataliia, Katerina, and Zhenya for your contribution, and Sasha, who I think it looked like she was on a train and was cut off there, but we appreciate her contribution as well. So again, so thank you again, and goodbye.